Hi.
Hello.
Your hair is longer.
Oh, yep. Yep.
How are you?
Excellent. So I'm still up in here in Stockholm, but heading back to Oxford on Monday. So I've been having a Swedish summer.
How is your Swedish summer?
Quite nice, actually. Well, the elder generation in my family, all independent, decided to get sick in various ways. So my husband and me have been running around handling that. But now things have stabilized and we actually managed to get some pretty nice holidays.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I mean, Sweden, give me your picture of how the world has handled this pandemic, but particularly Sweden, because it seemed to be catching a lot of flack, at least in the American press.
Yeah, so Sweden is basically the control group of Scandinavia. Because of a bundle of reasons, some good, some bad, Sweden didn't do very much and did it relatively slowly. While Norway and Finland kind of went all out, okay, civil contingencies, open up the old stores and prepare for everything. So they did a lot of rather tough measures rather early on. And in terms of actually saving lives, that has worked out pretty well. There is an interesting question about, well, what about the economic impact? Sweden is doing well, but so is the rest of Scandinavia. It seemed to have been rather independent, which might have meant that, yeah, a lot of people died in Sweden that could have saved, except that there are also constitutional problems. You can't actually order people to stay home in Sweden.
There are so many, I think, ethical questions which we'll launch into, but even before that, just for our viewing audience, tell me who you are.
So I'm Anders Sandberg. I'm a senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at University of Oxford. And my job is to think about the far future, trying to think about how can we think well, rigorously about the future, global catastrophic risk and other weird things, and see if we can do something useful about it.
But you also look at the ethics of some of these decisions that we might make as well, right? Is that part of the rigorous aspect of you looking into the future?
So one of the reasons I ended up in Oxford was a project about the ethics and the social impact of cognitive enhancement. And I got in there mostly as a lapsed computational neuroscientist. I could explain the brain to philosophers. But I also realized that ethics is quite an interesting question because it's about value. What should we be doing? What's actually a good outcome? Science can certainly tell us a lot about the how and what's likely, but you also need to have a value theory. And that's, of course, strongly disputed. We don't agree at all on what's really important in life and where life should be going, which means that understanding how value and possibility play out, this is where we really get to the gist of futurism. Because in the end, the future studies should not just be entertainment about what might happen, but also, what should I do next Tuesday?
Yeah, I mean, so when we think about value propositions, both in the micro or in the personal and in the macro, how do we bridge those two in a way that's practical and cohesive?
Well, it depends a lot on different value theories. And I find it useful to, since I'm a Scandinavian and don't like conflict, I just line up all the value theories I can think of and try to see what are they saying, which ones do end up in conflict, which ones are agreeing with each other. And then we can kind of line up a smorgasbord, so to say, of options. And quite often, value theories don't disagree. So thinking about COVID and triage, for example, it turns out that normally the deontologists and consequentialists and virtue ethicists, they're all at each other's throats in the, at least in the philosophy department. But when it comes to the question, okay, are we going to treat here with a limited medical resource? They basically all line up and agree on roughly how you go about doing. And then they look at each other awkwardly and have a new quarrel about why this is the sensible thing to do. But they all agree that it is the sensible thing to do.
So does that mean the practical, I mean, how we get there is the stuff of philosophy and academic discussion, but the actual practicalities play out in the same way?
Well, there is this mixture. So if you think about medical ethics, there are a nice set of high faulting principles that all doctors get told about. And the ghost of Hippocrates is kind of hanging around, causing actually all sorts of harm, in my opinion, because his injunction, first, do no harm, is actually quite risky, because it means that doctors should rather not treat the patient than have any chance of making things worse, which made a lot of sense back in the day because most treatments were making things worse. Today, there are actually interesting options. But then you get out in the actual world, and suddenly the situation gets messier and messier, because you have a finite amount of time and resources, and you have laws in society that might actually not align very well with medical practices. And sometimes you get interesting situation when the police gets involved and realize, wait a minute, all the doctors are doing something that's actually kind of technically illegal, and we let them get away with it for decades. What do we do now? So in many cases, you have this contradictory mess. In some cases, politicians decide on laws that affect medical practice, which sometimes fit what everybody agrees on. And quite often, now that's one bunch of people, and another bunch of people think we should change the laws. Meanwhile, the doctors are actually trying to make the best of the situation. Now, this is how the sausages get made in a lot of disciplines. Medical ethics is kind of an obvious one, and it's kind of juicy and gory and fleshy, so you can do much more about that. But thinking about the future, where are we going to end up in the future? Well, technology policy and where civilization should be going. Yeah, these are important questions, and some people are pushing in different directions. But it's also very contradictory. And just like our present is the result of a contradictory past, we should expect the future to be something similar.
So it seems like part of the challenge, at least, so that, you know, what's the silly expression that all oars are rowing in the right direction, is actually not, well, number one, to actually be speaking the same language, as it were. And then secondly, try to actually codify or make these value systems, or at least these principles, cohesive. I mean, that seems like a massive challenge, and something that you've probably thought a little bit about.
Yeah, so there is this nice metaphor due to the philosopher Derek Parfit when he was looking at the various ethical systems, and they all have very different ideas about what should be done. But they more or less all agree that you shouldn't steal stuff. So he pointed out that mid-level principles tend to converge. And it's a bit like mountaineering. You're climbing from different directions and maybe using different tools, but you're actually ending up roughly in the same spot at the top. So it could be that actually there is a lot of convergence. And when you look at what people want to do, most people don't want to harm others. They want to have a nice life. What is a part of a nice life, people make different lists, but you will find a lot of overlap between them. Very few people have a really weird idea about what a nice life is. Most of us are very, very conventional. And similarly, I think what is happening here when trying to pull the future, most people actually are trying to pull in the same direction. It's just that we disagree about exactly how to go about it. So some of the big ideological struggles are that people totally disagree about whether a free market is actually more likely to get there than a bunch of technocrats making a sensible decision for us.
So if we are, you know, for the most part, have the same wants, and obviously we do have the same needs, I mean, biologically speaking, right? I mean, you know, one would think that we could have, I mean, is it necessary to codify these, I guess, principles or limits for society?
Well, philosophers like codifying them, partially because that's what we're good at, but also because it brings a lot of clarity to what's going on. When you start talking about justice, for example, what do you mean by that? It's kind of an important thing to have a somewhat precise idea about what kind of justice you have. When you're getting into ideological conversation, equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are two similar sounding things that are actually producing very, very different results. And that's a relatively straightforward thing. Now, on the other hand, when you want to codify something out in society, you also need to deal with thick concepts. So The ideal philosophy paper is going to be about a very thin concept. It's going to be very well defined, shorn of any weird connotations and all of that complicated stuff. And then you do something impressive with it and end up with the conclusion, and you get it published in a good journal. Meanwhile, if you're out on the street fighting for justice, the definition of justice might actually not matter quite as much. In fact, you might have quite a lot of very other important concerns. But you will, in that fight for justice, also have to think about, who do I ally myself with? Everybody says that they're in the favor of justice, but there are some forms of justice that are not compatible with my kind of justice. And many of these thick concepts that have a lot of complicated connotations are quite important. Just think about health. To be healthy is a very rich concept. It's not just that I'm not having COVID or it's not coughing too much. It should presumably be that I'm feeling well, that I'm having a good mental state, that I should be able to live my life as I should, etc. What about aging? As a transhumanist, I would say, yeah, aging is unhealthy and I would rather get rid of it. Others would say, wait a minute, the health should be tied to our biological nature, and our nature is mortals. And then we get into a big quarrel over that. But in practice, this has to do with different aspects and concepts of health. And for some purposes, they come apart. But quite a lot we have this rich concept of health. We might say that, yep, that little old lady, she's drinking too much, she's smoking too much, and she is rather frail, but she's enjoying life to the fullest. She's actually a pretty healthy little old lady, even though technically if she ate her veggies and didn't smoke, she would probably be having a little bit better immune system.
So there are so many factors. We are both very complicated creatures, and at the same time there is some simple truths. You know, I mean, we say simple. I mean, if we look at death, for example, I mean, we've redefined it even in the last 50 years. So even those questions are complex, because I think what you're saying, if I'm reading between the lines, is in order to achieve these things, we need to codify, or at least have these principles in some way so that people can abide by them, so people can recognize them, so people can understand them. Is that one part of the process for us?
I think codifying principles is useful, because then you can relate to them much better than just having some vague thing. When people start talking about justice or solidarity, now I'm of course infected by being in the philosophy department, I immediately start asking, what do you actually mean? Everybody who starts using the word neoliberal in a conversation better define it. If they don't, I will define it, and then they are going to be in trouble. But in many cases, that clarification of principles, that's the starting point. It's not the end point, because once you have some rough idea of where you're going, you still need to figure out a lot of other stuff. And our brains are rather limited. So when we start working on a big project, we are going to learn things that are going to change our understanding what the project is about. There are a few cases where we know exactly where we want to go and how to get there, and then we just fill in the steps in between. But quite often we find halfway through that, oh, we were wrong about the goal. This is not what it's about. So when Nixon declared a war on cancer I think in 1972 or 73, people believed that cancer was a thing. There could be a cure for cancer. And what happened in the 70s and 80s was the understanding that, oh, yeah, there is this generic thing that goes wrong in cancer. But it's a lot of very different processes, and different cells react in different ways, and we need different treatments. So from one perspective, the war on cancer is just like the war on drugs and the war on terror, totally failing, because there wasn't a particular target. On the other hand, we learned a lot. We actually got good at treating cancer. Cancer became way less deadly. And although it's still not beaten, we're getting there. So the problem with the big projects for the future might be that when we start undertaking them for real, we are going to learn things that might change our course drastically. So this is something Nick Bostrom calls crucial considerations. It's a bit like you're out hiking and you suddenly realize you've been holding the map upside down. That's a very important piece of information. And you want to figure that one out just after you left your base camp, rather than having hiked for one day. Because the earlier you get the crucial consideration can go in the right direction, the better.
So if we're looking at it in these sort of fighting or war-like narratives that we tell ourselves, whether it's the war on COVID or the war on poverty or the war on homelessness or the war on climate change, whatever, however we are now in battle. But the big problems that we face that you've already went down the path and realized, well, it's not climate change we're fighting, what are those things? What are the top things?
Yeah, basically you're asking, what is the world, the flesh, the devil? What are the big enemies here? And I think J.D. Bernal actually had a good point when he called his book, his proto-transhumanist book in the 1920s, The World, the Flesh, the Devil. There are some awkward problems with the world. Deep down, you could say that what we experience is a play between entropy and gravity, and that creates all this wonderful complexity. But there are these problems that we have various forms of material scarcity and energy scarcity and need to get rid of waste heat, which when you go up a few levels turns into questions about, well, where are we going to get our energy from? How do we build a sustainable environment? And it turns out that many of these questions are actually closely tied together. If we could just get enough energy, recycling is not a problem. It's not a problem to mine new resources and recycle them endlessly. If you have the right kind of atomically precise manufacturing or nanotechnology, now you can make whatever you want out of fairly common forms of elements rather than going for something very rare. So controlling the material world in the right way solves a lot of those problems. But we also have the problems of scarcity that come because of how we work as individuals. We are the people who are right now kind of finite, independent entities that are both slightly smart, selfish, and social, and irrational. So we try to help each other, and we try to hinder those we don't like, and we have our complicated little soap opera of social interactions. And that produces trouble even when we try to cooperate. We are probably the best cooperators in the animal kingdom. The ants are working on us. Because the ants, they just have instincts. They just implement a fixed program. Humans can sit down in the tribe and say, tomorrow we're going to go for a hunt, and this is my plan on how to do it. We can agree on the intention in the group. We can start a plan. We can even have updates on the plan if something goes wrong. What if there is a lion? And we can even decide on how to distribute the spoils eventually. Now, the cool thing is this allows us to do things that the chimpanzees and others simply cannot do. But it also means that first we need a big brain just to keep track of what's going on. And remember that, yeah, George is a little bit less reliable, so we better put him on behind those rocks. And yeah, we need to watch out for Jim because he's a bit too egocentric here. We better make sure that the division of spoils get done right. But we can do this. The problem is this doesn't scale necessarily perfect. And this is the source of so much in our societies because it's all about organizing and coordinating and making sure both cheaters that try to steal stuff or don't follow the rules don't prosper. And we also find that we still are stupid enough to create structures that don't do their job right. But suddenly we find that we made Jim the tribal chief, and he's of course exploiting that to his heart content. And we should probably have written a better constitution. Too late now. So this is the game theory part is the second part. That's kind of, in some sense, the devil. And then we have the flesh. Well, we are weak biological creatures. We get sick. We're not as effective as we could be. And in many cases, our emotions and thoughts are very short-sighted. So we don't foresee many of the big problematic consequences of making Jim the chief, or that we can't realize that those rocks over there are actually worth much more than anything else in this environment, but we haven't figured that one out yet.
So, I mean, I love how you've whittled it down to this really primal problems, and I can see how that translates into the macro. And so, I mean, if I think about it, it really is about placing people, or for people to find roles that they are both good at and comfortable in. So it is structuring this society in a way where there are less of the things that throw us, which is our emotions, our sensitivities, our greed, our, or at least where if we have those are going to be utilized in the pyramid of endeavors, as it were.
Yeah. Like Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. And in that speech, he points out that, well, it motivates you to find solutions, to come up with good stuff. Of course, he was also intended as an example of the worst part of capitalism. The problem is, of course, quite a lot of these good drives turn into something bad when you apply it in the wrong way. I've been looking this morning at questions about pain. And pain is absolutely necessary for surviving on the surface of Earth. If you don't
pain, P-A-I, pain.
Yeah, pain is really nasty. Indeed, it might be that it has to be nasty for it to do its job, because it needs to perhaps be intrinsically motivating to avoid it. Big philosophical argument here about whether this is strictly true or not. But certainly, people who are born without a sense of pain rarely survive, because they just harm themselves. They break bones and don't notice it. They bite their own tongue and don't realize that there is a problem. So you want that pain feedback, but you don't want the suffering. Or you want that strong signal, don't do that. And then you don't want to have a backache the rest of the day. You don't want to get punished for actually having done things right. And getting over pain turns out to be rather tricky, because evolution doesn't care if we're actually suffering way more than we need. Evolution doesn't care as long as we get enough kids in the long run. But we care. We really want to fix that. There are weird states where people actually have pain but don't suffer from it. And there are weird states where they have pain but they don't get motivated to do anything about it. And this is, again, rather bad, both for philosophers who get very confused by it, but also, of course, for these people, because they can't function in the actual world. So the problem here is pain is something you want a pinch of, motivate, but then we want to keep it rather low. Greed, you probably want good, creative kind of greed, but not the envious kind of greed. You want to have people trying to excel, but not too much. And at this point, Aristotle shows up and says, yeah, this is kind of what I call virtues.
Yeah, this is just before I forget, because I'm going to forget to even ask you. FM. So we made this movie, and you were in it. So what did you think of the film? Were the things you learned about FM? I mean, obviously you'd heard of him before, as you state in the film. Tell me about the experience of watching the film, yeah.
It's kind of a weird thing to be a futurist and have read FM, of course. But I never met him. I only met people who have met him. It's like that weird thing seeing Max talking about him, and of course I know Max, and Max knew him. But it's that odd thing about somebody who's not present in your world, but is kind of looming in a very important way. And I think this is true for many of our intellectual movements, like transhumanism. There are these people who are not present anymore. Some of them rather far removed in time, but still have this very powerful impact. The way they express things, the problems they think are important, and when they express it, have super big effects.
So you think that were there things that you learned about him that you didn't know?
Yeah, so yeah, I definitely learned things about him, because one important thing is reading somebody's articles. That tells you one kind of story, but then there is a link to who they actually were and who they interacted with. I've been working on a paper together with Thomas Moynihan about the history of wireheading. So this is basically the story about putting electrodes in the brain of rats and other organisms and affecting the pleasure center. And it turns out that, of course, this is just the backbone, because it branches out in all these weird directions. Suddenly, John Lilly shows up, and you get a link to dolphin studies and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And I think the same thing is true for FM. It ties together quite a lot of things. There was several moments where I felt, some puzzle pieces in my mind kind of linked up a little bit more. So in my book project, I'm writing, for example, about the history of future studies. And now after watching the movie, I kind of realized, I need to mention him a bit more clearly here, because he's actually doing an important bridge from the more traditional future studies, which themselves have an interesting story involving, including US strategic policy against the Soviet Union and giving money, no questions asked, to French intellectuals and expecting freedom to do what you want, and the transhumanist movement. Basically, what happened was that the US government were worried that future studies could become infiltrated by the Soviet Union because they're doing 5-year plans and prognostication. What if they convince all these leftist European thinkers about some non-liberal views? Let's throw money at them.
Huh,
Of course, what happened was the intellectuals took the money and said, "Thank you, sir," and ran off and wrote critiques of the Vietnam War and did all sorts of other stuff that didn't exactly appeal to the US government, but actually created a futurist environment that was trying to think about the world in radically different ways. And this is, of course, where I think FM fits in, because he then does this in a radical enough way to link up with the proto-transhumanism and the emergent modern transhumanism.
It's interesting. I just thought something. I mean, that is a weird tidbit. Before FM started writing about the future, he'd been writing these novels. And there was one particular novel called Identity Card, which is a very Kafkaesque book about this guy trying to get out of Iran. And he gets, it's really good actually. But apparently, and I remember reading this when I was researching, this was required reading for anybody joining the CIA who was, because you know, that anybody, so they would give this book because it really did tell of the crazy bureaucracy, and it painted Iran in this way post-Shah. So I just thought that was interesting. My son and I were discussing, well, actually, even before I ask you that, as we look at, because there's two factors that come in, and this was something that you said earlier, there's the sort of ethics in health, and then there's capitalism and so on. And sort of it seems to me that the biggest decision that leaders have to make right now is this idea of opening up versus locking down, right? And they're weighing the economic growth or economic impacts versus health. Now, just that ethical dilemma, how should, if they are being rigorous, I think is your term, in making these calculations in the most, I don't even know what that means, the most ethical way. Is there such a thing as the most ethical? Is it, well,
at this point, the consequentialists and the ontologists kind of sharpening the knives and looking at each other. Because, of course, when you said calculation, the consequentialist crowd over there, they kind of started smiling, and the deontologists got really, really upset. Because, of course, don't calculate what's right. You have a duty to do what's right. And then you look at various papers from the deontological side, and you find these very rigid, logical arguments. Actually, you could say they're doing kind of calculation what you should and shouldn't do, which is, of course, the gleeful response for the consequentialists who are more open to do this calculation. And then, of course, the critics point out, yeah, but you still need to know what you're maximizing. It's one thing if you're trying to maximize happiness and pleasure. Another thing if you're trying to maximize, let's say, the number of quality-adjusted life years across the future. Those two calculations might produce very different COVID responses. Indeed, it looks like they might have a trade-offs. Smaller trade-offs than we feared, actually. There was a very nice result posted by Max Roser at our World in Data, I think yesterday, where he showed that actually the good interventions that save a lot of lives against COVID also tended to reduce the economic impact of COVID.
They
which
did.
is good news, but we didn't know that in March. This is something we now understand, and maybe this is going to be true for the next pandemic. But
can you explain that, how they came to that? Like, what are the data points that intersect that give you that conclusion?
So our World in Data is trying to amass this wonderful data set about how many cases are there in different countries at any point in time, how are they changing, how much measurement are we doing, basically create the world's best overview of what we know about the current state of the pandemic, which is an astonishing amount of work, and Max and the others have done a sterling effort for this. But they, of course, have this database about everything in the world. They are trying to curate a good overview of what is the state of the world, what is the GDP of Tibet right now, and how many people are living in New Zealand for the moment, and how was that in 1963. So then you can take this data and start combining and start to see trends. Or in this case, you look at the change in GDP that has happened over the past few months versus how they did with COVID. And it turns out that, having a good response that reduces COVID cases and avoids a big outbreak is good for the economy. This is, of course, really bad news maybe for Sweden, even worse news for the UK, and really bad news for the United States.
Yeah, but I mean, because it's just a snapshot in time, is it too early to actually make those calls?
Well, we know that this right now is true for the economy, but maybe 10 years down the line, things change. It's a little bit like the debates about was actually the Black Death good for at least the United Kingdom? Because, well, yeah, a third of the population died, but suddenly land became plentiful. Farmers got way more bargaining power against the lords, and actually quite a lot of relatively good things seem to have come out of that devastation.
I mean, look, I mean, from my very limited understanding of natural selection and so on, I mean, these pandemics are good for natural selection. They're going to weed out the weaker and so on. I mean, so from a macro perspective, but I think your work is the both, is marrying the macro versus the micro, you know.
Yeah. Because from an individual standpoint, of course, dying is not fun. That tends to wreck most life plans. And you don't want people in your family to suffer and so on. So we have very different micro goals. Again, this is, of course, causing a lot of the political battles right now, because my micro goal of keeping my family safe and also not getting my lifestyle too interrupted means that I'm already struggling about having masks and social distancing. And then you have the macro goals where the government might want the economy to work, etc. And finding nice ways of handling that, we don't really know what the optimal solution was. In this case, different countries did different things, and you can look at the data and actually start looking at the results. We already know a fair bit about which countries did well on managing COVID, like South Korea, which countries have really flubbed it, some countries that just seem to have been lucky and been out of the way. And you can even start doing statistical analysis of what interventions made most sense, which ones seem to have been causally effective. This is great. This is an enormous experiment, except that, yeah, if you wanted ethics approval for unleashing a pandemic to test the world, no sane ethics board would ever have allowed it. And the real big problem, the real challenge for us now is remembering it. Because I think that suppose the vaccine arrives after Christmas and everything turns out to be nice. I think most of us will just want to forget 2020. Which is what happened in 1918 after the great flu pandemic. Even a few months after, some scholars were noticing, it's weird, we had a lot of people die and people have already forgotten about it. And indeed, for decades, people were not talking about the Spanish flu very much until recently when we got a bit more paranoid about pandemics, and that's a kind of good thing. But I think it's a foreseeable risk that we might lose a lot of important lessons from COVID. Just like some of the lessons from SARS were actually lost in countries where the people choose for various political reasons to just disregard early advice and instructions on what to do.
So, I mean, that sounds very pessimistic. That sounds very pessimistic. That doesn't sound very hopeful. I mean, do you think, I mean, I would hope that we have come a long way since 1918. I mean, I would hope that we're not living in such a ignorant space, one would hope.
We're still ignorant. It's just that we're getting less ignorant, and I think we're learning. So some of the responses to 1918 were low-key. People actually improved public sanitation, which turned out to be good, not so much for the flu, but for quite a lot of other diseases. Actually building healthcare system really started around this time, partially as a side effect of building these big institutions around the First World War, but then they got to turn into civilian organizations. And I think we now understand, oh, we can forget about important lessons from pandemics. Let's not do that. I've been in many meetings where we have all told each other, let's not forget about it. I've seen some people started to think about the monuments we need to erect. After all, in London, we have the Monument to the Great Fire, a kind of reminder that, look out, if you're not careful about fire safety, the city can get devastated. It's kind of fitting that it's right next to the insurance ghetto of London, with all the risk analysts actually seeing that flame-topped pillar. It's kind of doing its job, actually. So we might want to erect monuments to the heroic doctors who saved lives and gave their lives for doing this. And they kind of point out that Dr. Liu, he actually was silenced by the government, and you should never let the government silence doctors when they are speaking about health and so on. So we can do practical things, and we can even learn what attempts at doing practical things worked and didn't work. For example, after SARS, China instituted a reporting system to try to nip the next outbreak in the bud. It failed because the local authorities in Wuhan seem to have decided, oh, that would be bad news and the timing is really awkward. Let's slow things down a little bit. I bet there are some Chinese technocrats who have decided that after this clears up, we're going to have a new system that local authorities cannot fudge. Of course, they might have a problem because there might be other good reasons in our authoritarian society to fudge information. This is one of the big problems with authoritarian systems. But we are learning. So I'm kind of optimistic. We just need to survive long enough to learn to become really good at it.
So you said something about 10 minutes ago that I'm trying to remember the term, but you called it, had this idea that contentment, or at least this sort of quest for happiness, that is a fact, that is one of the factors that should be looked at. I mean, how is that measured? How is that defined? What is, is that, give me a sense of that, because that seems like a big thing in addressing any issue, because, well, give me a sense of how it's defined first.
Well, the big problem is measuring happiness is, of course, like catching a butterfly. It's very tough, and if you succeed, you might actually harm what you're trying to catch. So you can certainly give people questionnaires and ask them, on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy do you feel? Or how content are you with your life? And people have been struggling with this a fair bit. So there is actually a fairly large academic field that is trying to understand subjective well-being, happiness, etc., and compare it between different countries over time and so on.
Should that be, I mean, to me, I think that has to be a locus in this thing, but is that something that policymakers are bringing into the mix, or how do you?
No. So the interesting thing is that a few years back, the political left got very interested in happiness studies. The reason was this finding that different countries, as they get richer, they get happier up to a point, and then it levels off rather strongly. And obviously, we might want to have happiness rather than a lot of wealth. So saying we should maximize GDP, that's wrong. We should be maximizing happiness, these people said. And of course, Bhutan famously said, oh, we're going to go for a gross happiness index instead, which both served certain political ends well and got people very happy. Now we have a useful way of arguing against the right and all their dollars. The problem turned out to be that reality didn't fit political wishes very well. It's kind of messy. Even if you're fairly rich, getting more money will make you slightly happier. And it turns out that one reason many people are happy in rich societies is that they have a lot of freedoms and so on. But the end result was there was a lot of interest, and it's very clear that different societies do have different mixes of types of happiness, and there might be drastic changes. Go to Eastern Europe and you're actually going to find it noticeably less happy than Western Europe. And part of that probably has to do with questions about religion and culture and the legacy of the communist system. It can actually leave really long marks. There are weird questions about, well, what about food? The Danes are happiest in Scandinavia. They also live shorter than the rest of us. Could that be that they have so delicious food? So the smørrebrød is kind of keeping them happy and killing them at the same time. So it turns out to both on the national level, it's tricky to talk about a gross happiness because many people are very differently happy, and you have inequalities of happiness, which are of course tremendous. But given that it's hard to redistribute happiness, people don't really talk very much about them. We mostly talk about inequalities where we can meddle. But individually, there are genetic factors that are very important for happiness levels. We tend to have a mood set point. It's not absolute. It can shift over the life, and certain life events can move it, but it's not going to budge that strongly.
Is that for an individual? Is that for each individual? So people's...
So you could call it a mood set point or a hedonic set point. So I happen to have very high hedonic set point. Almost no matter what happens, I'm pretty cheerful and happy. Somewhat embarrassing at funerals, of course, but generally I enjoy it. I also have relatives who have a very low set point. And this is, of course, super unfair. Even if good things happen to them, they go up a bit and then they return to their gloomy selves. So part of this is probably just pure biology, variants that do seem to be predisposing in different ways. Some of it, though, is psychology. It seems like some of these genes actually act on our personality because of how we interpret when we get a happy surprise or a sad discovery, whether we respond in the right way. And depending on our genes and the way we think, we end up with a personality that is cheerful or not. Now, the important thing would be, could we push things up? First, help the people who are really gloomy and really suffering for it. But in the end, maybe we could make everybody really happy and see what's beyond the current happiness ceilings.
I mean, this again, even as you say that, and this does bridge into this discussion that I was having with my son about CRISPR and the sorts of things we might be able to do. And it gives right, and it dovetails into this idea that that technology is going to allow us to do various things. You know, in the film that I made, you know, there was this idea that we could achieve these things, but there were capitalistic and various other issues. I mean, as we get to a place where, you know, but even how we frame it, we call it designer babies, where we're not saying, well, actually there are various things that could kill us or could create congenital defects or whatever. And if we were able to remove them, should we? I mean, so there are all these questions. So without giving you too much to sort of unpack, how should we be looking at those things so that we can have the greatest, I don't know, contentment for individuals and society, and that we can, what was it, how did you put it earlier on, where everybody will fit into the matrix of their roles in this cohesive, I don't know, friendly, cooperative way?
Yeah. So one question is, of course, even, is that matrix something fixed? And I would find it rather horrifying, this idea of a fixed society that is unchanged, where we're all in a little place, even though some people, to them, that sounds like heaven. There are some people who really, really enjoy having the firm social bonds, and loneliness is the kind of the worst thing ever. Other people can go, meh, yeah, I was self-isolating for a month, nothing to it. This is, of course, depends a little bit. Indeed, it does depend on some genetic and neural differences. And it might be a good idea to have a right mix, because you both want a society that can evolve and change and discover new stuff, but you also want to have that warm, fuzzy core where many people can just feel like they belong. And when it comes to the designer babies, I think you can start out on the micro scale. What changes would make sense? And I'm probably fond of Julian Savulescu's principle of procreative beneficence that says, yeah, all things being equal, you want to give your child the best possible life they could have. But that's typically not going to depend on being green and having wings. Maybe that actually turns out to be an awesome life, but you can't know that. That's really particular and really weird. But on the other hand, being healthy, being smart, being long-lived, a lot of these things are good for practically all life projects. If your life project requires you to be dumb and sick, then you probably should reevaluate your life project anyway. So that's the micro scale, and you could totally imagine having parents just wanting to do that for the kids. You probably don't need to do much propaganda to have people want to do that. You might want to keep parents from doing more stupid stuff. But you also want to think about, okay, how do I institute my society to achieve this? Do I subsidize CRISPR? That might be one good idea. It might be that you want to have insurance. So if kids are unhappy with how their genes come about, they can sue the parents, and you want to, as a parent, to have parenting insurance. And the premiums go way up if you want to give your kid the wings and a green skin. So that's going to act as a soft thing. Or maybe you just have a rule against doing really stupid stuff. You can solve this in a lot of very different ways. And different societies might even say, yeah, because of these moral and cultural reasons, we are going to set up this particular system. While others might actually say, we want flexibility.
And then historically we see, because we also have this need to come out on top, or certain of us do or don't, and there's these sort of self-drivers that we will try to figure out, or some of us will try to figure out ways to screw with the regulations or not, you know. And so one would think that one of the first things that we should remove, but it goes back to what you said earlier with CRISPR, is this idea of, you know, greed, but you want a little bit, but not too much. We've got all of these, so yeah.
So when I make my mental list of what would I've changed about the human condition, most emotions do get a pass. I just want to refine them. There are very few emotions I say, yeah, let's get rid of that. Cruelty, I think, is one that we actually want to throw away. So cruelty is taking pleasure in the misfortune or frustration of somebody else. And I think there might even be a good reason why we have that emotion. And that is, in that little tribe, when we want to keep Jim from misbehaving too much, sometimes we need to tell him and yell at him, or even throw rocks at him because he's disobeying the norms. Unfortunately, he's yelling at us back and throwing rocks at us. It's actually no fun arguing with Jim because he's a bit. So the problem is, being pro-social means that I need to actually take a hit for the team and have a fight with Jim occasionally. That is tricky. So evolution has kind of sweetened the deal. There is this cruel relish in messing with Jim because I don't like him. Now, this is great if we're a small tribe. But today we have police forces. We have reputations. We have locks on the doors. We have certificates on the internet. Basically, what we have done as we scaled up society is that you can't just rely on people working together in a nice way. You set up a police force, the chieftain has his guards, and then gradually the guards turns in an army, and the army needs accountants to make sure that nobody's stealing the money. So we create all sorts of systems, guardrails, locks, reputations that keep us behaving well. Much of the core of this is still very human. I'm not stealing because my mother told me at a very early age that it's wrong to steal. I also learned a lot because when I took toys from my brother, he hit me back. So these have inculcated certain behaviors. But later on, of course, now I have a reputation to defend. If it turns out that I'm not returning books to the library, oh dear, my reputation as a good academic might suffer. Or I might get a fine. Or if it's some more serious crime, the police might grab me. So we have created an interlocking set of safeguards, which means that cruelty might actually not be quite as important anymore. Because the modern counterpart of Jim, that guy who's misbehaved, well, we can actually call the police. We can actually call the insurance company and so on. We can rein him in using other tools. Now, the problem is we are becoming dependent on this complicated edifice of civilization instead. If that crashes, it's suddenly back to rocks and trying to handle Jim on our own. But we better make civilization work because we can't survive without it. And it has so many good things to give us. Everything from the art and music over to not having to throw rocks at misbehaving neighbors.
But I mean, the sort of locks and guardrails and so on. I mean, certainly in this country, we've put so much emphasis on that rather, and the obeying of rules, and particularly in certain neighborhoods and people of for Black people and brown people. I mean, it's so fundamental. I mean, and I think, is that a question of, it's not a question of the code. I mean, the code is right. It's a question of who we've asked to. I personally think it's about the emphasis on order versus, and scapegoats versus, something else. And how do you explain that you know, where here we are, we've become so complex and we've put all of these things in place. And like you said, there's prisons and psychology and there's rehabs and there's all of this. If all of these things are much more rigorous and much more codified and complex, why are they so terrible? I mean,
well, that is a wonderfully complicated question. There is an interesting attempt at answering that from Eliezer Yudkowsky, his little book, Inadequate Equilibria. So one of his examples, it turns out that there is a nutrient formula given to a newborn infant that if you're born too early, this is really bad for you. This is a well understood medical problem, and yet it's being given to apparently hundreds of infants across the United States every year.
Huh.
Why isn't anybody fixing this? And he looks at the various interlocking forms of stupidity. Basically, the rules force doctors to do certain things, and no doctor has a strong incentive to fight against these rules. The American Medical Association have another set of incentives, which means that they are not going to be rocking the boat. In this case, we accidentally ended up with a situation that harms some innocent people. And this is, of course, just one of many ways the world is broken. And typically this happens because of game theoretical situation. We are in some kind of game theoretical equilibrium where I could try to fight against the system, but it's going to grind me down. If everybody did it, it would be no problem, but everybody will not do that. So we need to find other ways around it. And sometimes we do. Sometimes we come up with innovations that allow us to do things. The printing press, for example, made the freedom of speech way easier. Suddenly it was actually fairly hard to control the flow of information. So many of the equilibria that previously controlled the flow of information in the world broke down. And we can do that technically. Sometimes we do it using social solutions. People organize themselves. We're not that bad at organizing and coordinating. Sometimes we come up with clever ideas and codes for organizing. But these equilibria are a little bit everywhere. If we just build stuff in a stupid way, we end up with them. And then we need to fight against them. And sometimes they can be very tough. The United States is kind of in a big mess because there is a lot of complicated stuff that needs to be modified at the same time by people who don't agree with each other. And partially they're polarized because of other feedback systems. This makes it a real mess to update. This is, of course, why people go on about, oh, I want to found my own nation on the ocean and do sea study, because at least with that blank slate, I'm not going to do those stupid stuff. The problem is, of course, that's a pipe dream, because most of the time we have to make do with existing big systems and retrofit them. This is, of course, the big challenge for transhumanists, because biology, if you think the United States is a mess, just look at biology. Aging, that's the counterpart really of a mixed up legal system. A lot of metabolism is harming us, but fixing the metabolism, well, we need the metabolism to stay alive.
I have a specific question. What's your take on cryonics versus mind uploading? What's your, because it's interesting how people seem divided on these topics.
So I think in the long run, I definitely want to be uploaded, but first I want to see it work. Yeah. I'm not going to be the guinea pig. I want to be the man in lab coat with a clipboard standing next to it and say, yes, it looks like the test subject survived. Then I'm very happy to be uploaded. However, that might take a while. So in order to get to that future, you want to preserve your brain. And it used to be Cryonics was the only game in town, except of course not dying, which is of course always even better. Now we have issues about plastination or aldehyde preservation, which are started to kind of compete against cryonics, which I think is great. Because in many ways, although I love cryonics as a concept, I'm very happy to openly wear my necklace with my cryonics tag. Yeah, it needs competition. We need to up the game here. We need to prove what works, try to improve the technology, get better science. And I think cryonics have been rather slow in doing that. So now the new stabilizing people, they're giving a bit of competition. They of course also have to prove that stuff. So I think that competition is going to be very good.
Now we speak a lot to Ken Hayworth, and we did a lot of the videos for the brain preservation stuff, and I think it's really interesting what they do. It's just funny to me how in my mind, that, you know, they're looking at the same problem, I mean, different methods and so on, and yet it seems that people still have, I guess, a cultural or philosophical problem with this, with both of these ideas. As if both of them were solutions, it's more about, oh, well, you know, this whole idea of, well, am I a copy? And is this really me? And, but they don't really see that with cryonics. It's, oh, that's mine. So do you know what I mean? Like, but there does seem like a real divide in the sort of transhuman community around these issues, which, I don't know, it seems an odd thing to have a divide about. But maybe this is exactly what you were saying. We then get into the thing, and philosophers, but then I've forgotten how you call it. We have
the different gangs of philosophers, but this happens to humans naturally. If we're a large enough group, we are going to organize ourselves into subgroups. And then we are going to tell ourselves in our group that we're so much better than those guys. Why are we doing that? Well, we want to safeguard our egos, even if it's just a random assignment to group. The problem here is, of course, when things matter, when there is actually something at stake, and especially something at stake that is close to your existential concepts and your philosophy of life, you can become rather harsh about it, even though you should be intellectually humble and actually realize, yeah, actually, we are all very uncertain about these things. We should be working together. But unfortunately, we have this monkey in a way of thinking that, oh, us versus them. So when it comes to thinking about cryonics and brain emulation, I find it that, yeah, brain emulation requires a rather long laundry list of philosophical and scientific things to be true. I think they are true, but I know I don't have proof of that. I think it would be very cool to try to gather evidence to show that. Cryonics needs another list of things to be true. And again, we need to do research about that. But it's quite possible that both of them are pipe dreams because there is something fundamentally wrong. And that there is no shortage of people outside the community who are all too eager to say that. Usually using very smug and very bad arguments, which means that uploaders and cryonics people at least can say, yeah, we don't buy that. But sometimes, yeah, there are good reasons to be cautious about what can work and not work. And we should be investigating that.
If you were designing your I hate to call it heaven, but like your afterlife, your upload environment, whether that's a way thing, what would you like your brain to be uploaded to? Have you seen there's a show called Upload? It's very good, actually. It's worth.
Oh yeah, I need to watch it. I heard Robin was being skeptical about the economics, but go figure. Nobody ever does the correct economics on any science fiction show. Yeah, so I just want a little Jupiter brain. Basically,
a little what?
A Jupiter brain.
Okay.
So my first ever published scientific paper was actually about daily life among the Jupiter brains. Basically, how big can you make a computer? And I'm updating it now for my book project, but basically, having just 1.4 liters of neurons, or the digital counterpart if I'm uploaded, why not twice? Why not 1,000 times more? Couldn't one actually think better thoughts, or more thoughts, or even run more Anderses? The day is too short. I have so many things to do and so many interesting new directions. So if I existed virtually, I would soon have 1 or 2 copies working on projects. And we would, of course, soon realize, oh, I need a few extra copies. And before you know it, you would have an entire society of us. Hopefully that society would be stable. There's no guarantee that I would get along with myself. The heaven can lead to all sorts of bizarre disasters. But there's also this interesting possibility of modifying minds. And if you're digital, you can press the undo button if that was a stupid thing. You can even have an original copy of yourself with the undo button because you can't trust the modified version. Some very deep ethical issues here about what I can pre-commit to. After all, I can't pre-commit to quite a lot of medical procedures that would be interesting from a scientific standpoint, but would probably be unethical to do with people. However,
well, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that we sort of played out in the film is, you know, obviously anybody who's frozen now, or if they had plasticized or preserved their brain, you know, wouldn't have any rights. But there's these, you know, these ideas of living wills, or ideas of what what one could do or not do. I mean, I imagine that as the law becomes more thoughtful, I guess, about some of these issues, that these are things that we will have to sort of, like, I don't want, you know, can we dictate? I don't want to be part of like some weird museum exhibit in the future where I'm, you know, whatever. I mean, like, so I imagine that the work of Anders pre this is actually going to be quite, you'll need some extra, and some extra liters, because I mean, because we're not just thinking about, you know, how in most contracts, you know, it says something like, in all things imagined or whatever, you know, I've forgotten the legalese term of, you know, this covers us for this, but if there's other things, but I mean, the things that again, in this process, that one would have to think about in terms of informed consent are massive, because, right? I mean, what are some of the, if you were drafting this, and this is pretty much, because I know I could talk to you all day, so this has been a lot of fun, but I'll leave
and it
this.
would be hilarious to actually try drafting it, because I'm married to a prosecutor. We have actually had some rather fun legal conversations about these topics.
Well, I should have you both on to debate this and how you'd put this on. That seems like a fun.
Yeah, he's not signed up for Cryonics yet, but when we got married, my vows to him actually end till death do us part temporarily. After the ceremony, he pointed out, as a lawyer, I need to tell you that actually, if one of us dies, that actually ends the marriage. But I'm willing to give you a second chance, which I think is totally reasonable if there is just one of me. There's going to be a really weird problem if there are multiple Anderses. How many can be married to the same person and so on? But I think this is the kind of legal conundrum that people can solve. After all, we solved legal conundrums for thousands of years. This is what lawyers love doing, especially when they get paid for doing it. There is also the ethical conundrum, and I think that one is tougher. Can I pre-commit to do brain surgery to myself that might actually leave me a horrible wreck, and then just undo it, which means ending the life of that horrible wreck, even though it gets replaced, of course, by a fresh copy of me who have no memories except some very disquieting pictures of the previous experiment. Let's not do that ever again. I think that's all right, but I know some ethicists who say, no way, Anders, that we're not going to allow you to do that. So there is a good ethics debate to be had here.
Matter. I mean, but what about the harm? I mean, if it's a question of harm, are you killing? Are you harming that entity, that Anders? I mean, you know, if that's the number one.
Now, the tricky part here is, of course, yeah, but what if I go to the dentist? I might be suffering some pain and a removal of a small amount of tissue, but it's for my own good in the long run. And this would have been true even as a kid, even though I didn't fully understand it back then. My parents would still have a role as my guardians to drag me to the dentist and say, yeah, this is for your own good, stop squealing. Now, could I do the same thing with myself? Well, one version of me and another version of me are in some sense on par. It's less clear that we can be guardians to each other. I might still sign up a contract saying that I'm totally happy for version number 2 to do brain surgery on me. However, an outside part of me say, yeah, but that's stupid, Anders. You're a bit gullible and you don't understand ethics that well. We're not going to think this contract was a valid one.
Let's talk about, I mean, also, do you trust the society that's going to bring you to, I mean, it's more like when we imagine the society that's going to bring us back, it's like, well, you know, how is me going to be immersed in that society? Am I going to be an idiot, a child? You know, what's my role? Am I just like a, you know, something for people to look at, to learn from? Can I really be a member of that future society? I mean, there are so many. And then can I impose whatever this contract says on this future society? I mean, will that hold up? I mean, there are even those which are even bigger than the actual clauses in the contract itself.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of writing a paper about who to bring back. So in normal ethical discourse, the problem about future generations is that, okay, they're not born yet. So in some sense, they don't exist. They don't have any rights. Except that most people would say, actually, leaving a bomb in the forest that will blow up in 100 years and kill people in the forest at that time, that's wrong, even though none of these people exist yet. you're still doing something nasty here. And the fact that your actions are also going to affect who comes into existence doesn't mean that you can do anything you want. So this is, of course, part of Parfit's Reasons and Persons, where he's talking about the non-identity problem. But cryonics makes it an identity problem. There is a frozen guy in that liquid nitrogen. That's a particular person. And now you have a choice in the future society. Do you bring him out or not? And in some cases, it might be that, yeah, that's a great philanthropist who did very nice stuff, and that's the nasty sociopath guy who you start with. And maybe at this point, you have a really interesting ethical dilemma, because you actually know information about them. If it had been just these nondescript tanks and it's kind of random, in many ways, the ethics is way easier.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, if you're in the future, you're designing, you know, the monsters of the 20th century, you want to have a psycho, you want to put, you know, so-and-so, you know, you've got whoever.
We can fill up a menagerie with our political opponents. But there is actually a real problem here, but if moral progress is real, which some people actually think, and I think there is some truth to that, that might mean that if we bring somebody back from the past, they might actually be, morally speaking, a little bit problematic. Just imagine bringing somebody from the Victorian era back, and we have to tell them gently, by the way, that racism, that homophobia, that sexism, it's not done anymore. The Queen would be most upset if she heard you say that. That's perhaps doable, but it might be that in the future we have enhanced ourselves even more. So no cruelty. We're all very, very sane and sensible people. And then we get in one of those guys from the 21st century back.
This is a science fiction film just in the making.
And I think most of the time we are telling stories which are about us right now. And I think one can, of course, have a very fun story about the problem that we are morally cruel and the future will have trouble with it. But there is also a really deep ethical problem about our obligations, even to the crude people in our past. If we could bring Neanderthals back, maybe we have a kind of moral responsibility, because I think we have a feeling that us Homo sapiens might have had a hand in wiping them out. Oops, maybe we actually have an obligation. But on the other hand, that's a real responsibility, uplifting another species. So there is a lot of good moral dilemmas here. Even if everybody's totally well-meaning and so on, you're still going to get so much cool anguish and drama from this.
No end. I would love to talk to you again, because I've got so many more questions for you, but we'll leave it. Thank you so much. It's really good to see you. You look good with your long hair, looks good. And I would love to do this. I would love to like serve as a, not that you need it, as an intermediary between your partner and you, and discuss like what this contract would look like. That seems like a fun thing.
That would be hilarious. Yeah.
Let's do that. That seems like a fun thing.
Yeah.
All right, you take care. All the best.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you.